When working on this model, you'll want to work on a foam cradle as to not damage any detail parts. First of all, you're going to want to remove the 4 corner grab irons by simply using a flathead screwdriver and kind of popping them out from the front. And you'll want to do the same thing on the rear as well. Just one side can be popped out, you don't have to remove them completely. Next is removing the shell. To do this, I like to use 4 round wooden toothpicks. You can put them in 4 corners of the model as shown here to kind of pry the shell off the chassis. You can use a screwdriver if you want to, but you might run the risk of marring the plastic or potentially cracking something. These toothpicks make things a lot easier and you don't need 4 hands to do it. You can just use 2 hands and then you can hold the shell, hold the fuel tank, slowly separate them, and as you can see, it falls off pretty easily and there's no wires to worry about either. 4 of these little tabs are what hold the shell to the chassis. If you buy your model with DCC and sound, this is what you'll find inside the decoder and 2 identical iPhone speakers, they're called. They're kind of just generic speakers and they're not very good. So the first one we're going to be removing is from the front. You can just get a screwdriver or even your finger, rip the tape off, and that thing is only held in with tape. There's nothing else holding it on, so you can just pull it up and kind of toss it off to the side. Then you're going to want to remove the 21-pin lock sound decoder. Just be very careful, kind of wiggle it off, hold down the PCB as you're doing it as to not bend any pins, and store it in a safe location. Now we can remove the rear speaker. There's a little plastic cradle holding this thing in. Just kind of hold down one side of it, pull up on the speaker, and it comes apart pretty easily. Next, identify and remove the 2 screws holding down the motherboard. And make sure you don't lose them. We're going to be using them later on to reinstall the motherboard. We're just going to be able to take those out so we can lift up the wires in the back. With the motherboard loose, we can now remove it and kind of pull the wires up in the back, allowing us to remove that plastic cradle from the rear. And you can go ahead and discard that cradle and then reinstall the same 2 screws that you just removed from the motherboard. There are 2 gray wires that are soldered onto the PCB for the speakers. Identify those, get your soldering iron out, and very carefully remove those wires. Make sure not to burn anything else. And now you have 2 free speakers. You can put them in a different model or you can toss them in the garbage. So this next step is not really required, but I recommend doing it. On these castings, there's some flashing right where the speaker is going to be sitting at, and it makes an uneven fitment for the speaker. So go ahead and use a old X-Acto blade and just start cutting away at these corners. You'll see a bunch of flashing and crap come off of them. You can do it on both sides. Don't worry about it being perfect because the speaker sits in there fine anyway, but if you want that perfect fitment that I like, then just go ahead, cut these off, and make sure everything is squared up. Now we can do a test fitment of our speaker. If you look at the bottom of the speaker, there's a bunch of crap on the bottom. This is just from the printing process. It doesn't actually matter for sound quality or fitment. That's just how it is out of the 3D printer. So we can go ahead and line this up with our model. The speaker sits on these flat surfaces on the back of the chassis, so make sure there's no wires bunched up on top of there. And also the wires will be pushed down. Make sure they do not touch the drive shaft or the flywheel of the motor. So go ahead and push the speaker in. There should not be too much resistance in there. Give it a little press on the top, and as you can see, it should be a very close to flush fitment on the top on both sides. Now we can solder in our speaker. The wires come pre-tinned, so you can just get your iron and solder onto the same 2 tabs as the speakers came off of before. There's no polarity on these, so either wire will work on plus or minus. Just make sure there's no wires touching or no bridges of the solder on the joint. Finally, we can install our speaker. So make sure the wires are pulled back a bit when pushing this down so they don't touch the flywheel of the motor below, and give the speaker a little push on top. And then we can go ahead and take our tape and put it over the speaker to hold it down. Just make sure you don't put the tape over the silver speaker component of the baffle, as it'll hurt the sound quality. I use Kapton tape here, but you can use normal black electrical tape too. It really doesn't matter too much. Just make sure the tape does not go below the frame rail, otherwise it'll show beneath the model, and obviously you do not want that. Grab your 21-pin decoder and hold the wires back on the PCB as you install it so they don't get pinched inside the connector. Give it a firm press down and it should be installed relatively easily. We can now reinstall the shell. When you put it back on, just make sure there's no wires hanging out to get pinched up. Otherwise, it's a very easy installation. It's kind of guide the shell back on there, click in the front, click in the back, and it's super duper easy. Now we can make sure our grab irons go back in on the front to the back, so get a pair of tweezers or something to put them back in, and that's really it. It's a super easy installation. Thank you for buying this speaker, and happy